So, Deborah, can you tell us a little bit about your journey in college athletics? And can you provide a summary of the main concepts of your chapter?
Sure. Well, my journey, I don't have a specific journey in athletics so much as I have a journey around my interest in athletics, of college athletics specifically. But I have been doing work on campus traditions or college traditions as a research stream in my research agenda. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to the point of writing what I wrote for this book was, I guess it was in 2017. I was on sabbatical that year and I was doing a project on campus traditions to where I was traveling around mostly the Midwest, but some East Coast states as well, visiting college campuses and trying to uncover some of their campus traditions. And a lot of them kept leading me back to athletics. And as you know, there's a lot of traditions that are aligned with sports in general, and that just is sort of magnified on college campuses, and even more so at D3 schools. But we'll get to that certainly in a little bit. And so that led me to write this, to do this work around traveling trophies as a campus tradition, a college tradition, and specifically at D3 institutions. And that's exactly what the chapter is about. It's just sort of exploring, telling the stories of how these traveling trophies came to be. I'm really fascinated with this idea of athletics and football in particular being the front porch or the entry point of an institution. And I think there's a lot that we can tell from an institution by their sort of public face that comes through athletics. And a lot of people, even community members, you know, begin to interact with institutions of higher education through sports, whether that's through by being a fan or whatnot. I mean, I grew up in a college town. I grew up in Blacksburg, Virginia. So I'm a Hokie by birth, right? But, and I can remember going to every single football game and basketball games and sometimes baseball games, you know, because that's just what you did in our town. And so that became this sort of entry point. So that being said, when you think about the traveling trophies, they become almost like a way to understand the institution itself and the culture of the institution itself through their stories and their histories. And that's exactly what I wanted to explore in this chapter. And there's a lot of commonalities between some of these stories. Some of them are based on the fact that they want to celebrate an individual or someone who's really important to the institution, whether that be a coach or a founding father or often alumni or even students. A couple of trends that I found really interesting in these stories were the involvement of alumni in establishing these trophies, and also the involvement of like local newspapers in terms of trying to drum up interest basically in these games, you know, but then at the same time, it becomes this rallying cry for the school itself or for the schools themselves, who were often geographically neighbors. And so it kind of drew people's attention to the games as well. And so there are lots of other stories as well. There's a certain philanthropic emphasis. There's an emphasis on sort of paying homage to the economics of the region, to sort of different unique characteristics of the region itself, where these institutions are located. And they are primarily, I think, you know, Midwest, East Coast, some in the South. But that makes sense, you know, kind of given the trajectory of higher education institutions and how they were, you know, founded and whatnot. So that's kind of a long way, you know, just sort of giving you the basics. And you've had a chance to read it, right? You've got a chance to read about the trophies. So anyway, yeah, that's it.
Awesome. So that was so fascinating. Liz and I both read your chapter and we loved it. So kind of my next question is like, do you have any personal experiences like with the trophies? Like what was your undergraduate, graduate, like institution's athletic culture like?
Great question. And I went to 3 schools for all of my 3D1 schools for all of my schooling, all SEC schools, by the way. So you might not want to talk to me anymore after you find out where all my places I've been, because we're rivals. But I went to the University of Georgia for undergrad. And so there is a very rich athletic culture that comes along with being a Bulldog. I went to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville for my master's degree. And I also did some interning with athletics through my grad program there, which was in college student personnel. And then of course, University of Mississippi, as I told you, for my PhD. So that's my SEC hat trick. But I think that the culture, athletic culture, is very strong in terms of how significant it was to being a part of the campus and the campus community at each of those schools. And so, you know, my experience, of course, was around being a fan, but also being involved in student organizations that supported athletics in various ways, whether that be through, you know, like I said, an internship with men's athletics that I did in my graduate program, or being a member of a sorority in my undergraduate program, which, you know, was sort of part of the culture was going to games, right? And being a part of the tailgating culture and all of that goes along with being athletic. So it's a very strong experience. I did start learning more about D3 institutions and, you know, the richness of the culture and experiences that students were having at D3 institutions when I was living in Ithaca, New York. So my first job out of my master's program was up in Ithaca, and that was when I first learned about one of the trophies I wrote about, actually, which was the Cortica Jug. And just thinking about, you know, as a community member, how did I experience that? And it was like mayhem, you know, basically is how you experience that as a community member. But there's of course more to the story, right? And that's part of what I was trying to get across in this chapter as well.
Right, thank you so much. And I actually went to undergrad at Tennessee, so
Oh, did you?
yes, graduated in 2019. So I'm right there with you. So I appreciate that a lot. Our next question, you kind of touched on this a little bit. Looking at modern day athletics, what are your thoughts on some of the newer trophies like Alabama's ball out belt or Miami's ball out chain? Just curious too, since so much of that is changing.
Since so much of the trophies are changing, or the culture of athletics?
Sorry. In some of the culture surrounding those trophies.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And, you know, the first thing is that we often think that a lot of these trophies have been around for, you know, 100 years, and they haven't. And the thing is that we hear people say all the time, we're going to start a new tradition, right? Well, first of all, who gets to say it's a tradition, you know, and how long does it have to be in place before it really is a tradition? And the reality is that you can say, okay, we're going to play for this belt buckle, right? For example, I mean, the objects, that's a whole nother, you know, thing we could talk about, of things that people choose to play for or position as trophies are so interesting to me. But I think you have to really think about even more so, like why someone wants to present a trophy in the first place. Is it motivation, you know, for athletes? Is it motivation for fans? Is it a rallying cry for fans? Is it to garner, you know, financial support in some way? And there's lots of different ways to go about that. So I think that it's just so interesting to hear, like, well, this is, like I said, a new tradition, right, coming up. And big schools have them. I mean, Alabama is a huge school, of course, compared to the schools that I was writing about here. So I don't know. I mean, I think they'll still continue. You know, I wonder, some of these trophies were played for, let's say like a 10 years or a dozen years, and then they stopped and then they'll come back. And that's kind of the ebb and flow too of college athletics sometimes in terms of prestige and popularity too, in terms of sports. So I think there's a wave that these traditions will ride, just as is common in sports and in football, especially in Southern schools, I think, and in the Midwest. Way up here in North Dakota, there's a lot of we pay a lot of attention to hockey up here. I think more so in a lot of ways than football, though we do have quite a football tradition too. But hockey tends to be the prominent sport, at least at my home institution.
Awesome. This is just all so fascinating to me. I love hearing about this and listening to you talk about it. And you kind of got to talk about our next question a little bit, but like with COVID-19, that just shook up a lot of things, right? So with many of these longstanding rivalry games that were canceled, or the trophies weren't able to be played for, how do you think that like is going to impact fan culture and those traditions moving forward for those traveling trophies?
I think it presents an interesting marketing opportunity for institutions to be able to say, well, this bronze turkey has stayed with such and such an institution for 2 years. It's time to get it back now, right? So it might serve, it could serve, I suppose, as an interesting marketing or a way for institutions to try to draw more people or draw attention to these games. I don't know that any of them will completely go away. I think some of them have in recent years, and I wrote about some of those that are still on the list, basically from for Division III traveling trophies with the NCAA, even as late as 2019. But yet they have sort of fallen by the wayside for various reasons, and it's rarely about lack of interest. It's more so I think a function of either the trophy goes missing, right, which is often a story in and of itself, or there's no one to like take care of the trophy or the tradition if the institution is not doing it. So we talked about how lots of times these are started by alums or community members or newspapers, or some of the older ones. There was a haberdashery in Northfield, Minnesota, that was responsible for initiating the traveling trophy between two schools in that town. And but if they didn't step in to do that, then nobody would have done it, right? So somebody has to take responsibility for it, and sometimes it's the school and sometimes it's not. But regardless, though, the point here I want to make is that regardless of whether or not the school is actually the ones who are in charge of the trophy still reflects on the institutions that are involved in the rivalry and in the quest for the traveling trophy. So in that way, it does serve sort of as a form of institutional messaging, whether institutions like it or not, right? That's the part of their public image. And most like it, it's not necessarily seen as a negative unless, there's like violence sometimes, comes with the exchange of trophies, or just vandalism, those kinds of things certainly do happen. So there's sort of an ugly side here somewhat, but that's part of the experience overall, though, and the stories of these trophies certainly over time.
Thank you so much. And we just have one final question, and kind of ending on a fun note. What was your favorite or most interesting traveling trophy you came across during your research, or just in your time as a college sports fan?
That's a really interesting question. I'd like to hear your answer to that too. The one that I really find fascinating is the GOAT Trophy, or the Go Trophy, as they sometimes called it, that St. Olaf plays for against Carleton College. And those two institutions are in the same town, that Northfield, Minnesota town, which is not far from Minneapolis, St. Paul. And, students and alums and everyone in the surrounding area basically knows about this trophy, and they've gone to great lengths to, paint it, to decorate it, to write institutional names on it. They pose with it for pictures, for paper, for the paper. Even today, you know, that is still happening. So it really is kind of this just a really long-standing tradition that I find so interesting. What are some of your favorite traveling trophies for football, or I suppose it could be for any sport, but so we're talking about football primarily.
Yeah, mine was the totem pole. I think you put in your research. I can't remember where it came from, but I was like, when I think totem pole, I think it's like a large. So I could just picture this school like carrying this large totem pole around. I don't know. I just thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
For me, it wasn't necessarily one, but I'm very fascinated with Texas schools for some reason. I think just the rivalry between, just because there were a few that we came across, or just generally during my research and writing our own paper. But I think just the relationships and the way rivalries, while Texas is in its own world of college athletics, they find a way to be like rivals with each other. So I loved researching some of those or trying to remember some of the specific names. In Texas Tech, but that
does South Carolina have any traveling trophies, or do they have any major rivals?
And I mean, Clemson and South Carolina have their game, like the Palmetto Bowl game. I don't know if there's like a physical thing that goes with
like a trophy they exchange. Yeah.
I don't know that we have a trophy. I know that at Carolina we do a tiger burn, and at Clemson they do a cocky burn. So the engineering students build this giant tiger, and then we go out onto Green Street Field and they light it on fire the night before the game, I think. Which I've only seen it once, which was last year before COVID. But yeah, I tried to look and I don't think we have a traveling trophy. So I was like oh, interesting.
I love this story, and those are great traditions too. And it sounds so ridiculous, you know, when you talk about it, but everyone knows what you're talking about at Carolina and at Clemson. Like, oh yeah, you know, they built a giant tiger and set it on fire. Like that's normal, you know. Like that's the buy-in, right? That's the buy-in to institutional culture. We had something similar when I lived in Ithaca. I worked at Cornell University, and we had something called Dragon Day, which is very similar, where engineering students would build this big they would build a dragon, and the architecture students would build something else, and then they would fight, and then they would burn them, you know. And it's like, that's so weird. But it's been going on for forever, and people look forward to this, and you know, classes are canceled, and it's just this, you know, event, right?
Exactly.
And I think a lot of these bowl games, like what you're talking about with between Carolina and Clemson, you know, oftentimes there are trophies attached to those. Ole Miss and Mississippi State play for the Egg Bowl, and they have an Egg Bowl trophy, which is literally an egg. You know, it's about this big, right? That they'll play for, that winner gets to keep. So. And that's part of it too, this physical domination in sport and in football of winning the trophy and taking it home with you. That's part of the tradition as well, is exerting dominance over your rival in this way.